Just as he was feeding his baby girl that morning, a quiet thought stopped him. What will she eat when milk is no longer enough? Living deep in the forest, finding truly clean and safe food is not easy. Trieu Duong realizes he cannot wait any longer. He decides to clear a piece of land, protect it from animals, and grow fresh vegetables for his daughter's future meals. But with time running out, can he finish everything and still make it to the market for seeds before night falls? Stay with us to see how this father prepares for his child's tomorrow. And if you enjoy warm, heartfelt stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Morning light slowly slipped through the narrow gaps of the stone house, spreading softly across the rough floor and the cool gray walls. Outside, the forest was only just beginning to wake, but inside, Trieu Duong was already sitting close to little Truc Lam, carefully feeding her milk one slow sip at a time. His hands moved with patient tenderness, steady and gentle, as if even the smallest movement needed to protect her comfort. He watched her closely, making sure she swallowed well, making sure she stayed calm, warm, and safe in his arms. Now and then, she blinked up at him with sleepy eyes, and each time his expression softened. A tiny drop of milk rested near the corner of her mouth, and he wiped it away with his thumb. For a few quiet moments, nothing else seemed to matter. The tools outside could wait. The work ahead could wait. Right now, there was only this small child in his arms and the deep, unspoken promise in his heart that he would always do whatever he could for her. As Truc Lam rested lightly against his chest, Trieu Duong's thoughts drifted toward the future. She was still very small, but she was growing day by day. He could see it in the way her eyes followed movement more clearly now, in the way her tiny hands opened and closed with more strength than before. It would not be long before milk alone would no longer be enough. One day she would need soft vegetables, gentle meals, and clean food prepared with care. That thought stayed with him. Out here in the forest, finding food was possible, but creating a steady source of safe food was much harder. He looked down at her and let out a slow breath. If he waited until the last moment, it would be too late. He needed to prepare now, while there was still time. After she finished drinking, he held her against his shoulder for a moment, patting her back with quiet care. Then he wrapped her securely against him with a cloth, adjusting it little by little until she sat comfortably on his back. He checked twice to make sure the fabric supported her well and that her head rested safely. Only when he was sure she was settled did he step outside. The morning air was cool, carrying the damp scent of leaves and soil. Near the stone house, the chickens were already moving around, scratching at the ground and making soft sounds as they searched for food. Trieu Duong glanced at them and then toward the banana trees nearby. He had raised the chickens already, and they had become an important part of daily life. They needed feeding, and he had no intention of neglecting them just because he had new plans for a vegetable patch. If he wanted the household to stay steady, he had to take care of everything one piece at a time. With Truc Lam resting against his back, he picked up his knife and walked toward the banana grove. He chose a thick banana trunk, then began cutting it down with controlled, measured strikes. He was careful with every movement, never jerking too hard, never forgetting the little girl he carried. The trunk fell with a heavy sound onto the ground, and he immediately began cutting it into manageable sections. The inside was moist and soft, good for chopping into feed for the chickens. As he worked, he spoke in a low voice, the kind of voice meant more for comfort than conversation. "We'll take care of them first," he murmured. "Then I'll make the garden for you." His words were simple, but they carried warmth. It was the tone of a father who thought of every task as part of keeping his child safe. He carried the banana pieces back near the house and began slicing them smaller, reducing them into soft chunks the chickens could peck at easily. The flock gathered quickly, clucking with interest as he spread the chopped banana out for them. He watched long enough to make sure they settled in, then wiped his hands and turned toward the patch of land he had been studying in his mind since dawn. It was a small area not far from the house, close enough that he could work while staying near Truc Lam. The ground there was covered with thick weeds and rough grass, but the soil beneath looked usable. If he cleared it properly and fenced it in, it could become the beginning of something important, a protected place to grow vegetables for the months ahead. Trieu Duong stepped into the patch and began pulling weeds from the soil. Some came out easily, but others clung stubbornly with deep roots. He bent low, gripping them with both hands, loosening the earth when he needed to, and tossing the weeds into a growing pile nearby. It was hard work, slow work, and before long, dirt clung to his fingers and under his nails. Yet he did not rush. He kept a steady rhythm, always mindful of Truc Lam's small body resting against his back. Every so often, he paused and reached back lightly, checking her position, adjusting the cloth if needed, making sure she remained comfortable. Those brief touches seemed to renew his strength. He was not just clearing land. He was carving out a safer future with his own hands. The sun rose higher, and the coolness of morning gave way to warmth. The patch slowly changed shape. More soil became visible. More weeds disappeared. With each cleared section, the idea in his mind started to look more possible. He imagined rows of leafy greens growing there one day, protected from wandering animals and easier to tend than anything growing wild in the forest. He imagined gathering those vegetables with his own hands and preparing them carefully when Truc Lam was old enough for her first small bites of food. That picture gave him energy. After a long stretch of weeding, Trieu Duong straightened up and studied the ground again. The land looked better now, but one problem remained obvious. The forest pressed in close from every side. If he planted here without protection, wild animals could come at night and destroy everything in hours. Small animals, hungry creatures, even careless wandering feet. None of it could be allowed to ruin what he was trying to build. So he moved on to the next task. He gathered wooden stakes from the pile he had prepared earlier and carried them to the edges of the cleared patch. Then, one by one, he began driving them into the soil. Each strike was firm and controlled. He worked carefully, spacing them with thought, making sure the boundary would be strong enough to hold. The sound of wood being set into earth echoed lightly through the trees. When one stake leaned, he pulled it out and reset it. When another felt loose, he packed the soil more tightly around it. He did not allow himself to be careless. This fence might be simple, but it had to do its job. It had to guard what he planted, just as he tried every day to guard the small life depending on him. As the line of stakes slowly took shape, Trieu Duong began tying horizontal pieces between them, using what he had on hand to create a rough protective barrier. His fingers worked patiently, pulling each knot tight, testing the strength before moving on. Sweat rolled down the side of his face and his shoulders ached from carrying both the baby and the weight of the work. But he kept going. From time to time, he turned his head slightly and spoke softly to Truc Lam over his shoulder. "It's almost ready," he whispered. "I'll make this safe. I'll make this good for you." His voice held quiet determination, the kind that did not need to be loud to feel strong. By afternoon, the small patch no longer looked wild and forgotten. The weeds were mostly cleared. A rough fence stood around the edges. The space was still simple, still unfinished, but it had changed. It now looked like the beginning of a plan, the beginning of a place where something could grow. Finally, Trieu Duong stepped back to look at what he had done. The sunlight fell across the fresh soil, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine the next stage. Seeds, water, sprouting leaves. The first real sign that his effort was turning into food. He slowly untied Truc Lam and brought her into his arms. She blinked sleepily, then settled against his chest as if she trusted the steady beat of his heart more than anything else in the world. He touched his forehead lightly to hers and looked past the fence toward the distant path leading to the market. He had finished a great deal, but one important step still remained. If he wanted this garden to begin, he needed seeds. The market was not close and the day was already moving forward. Could he still make it in time? Could he finish enough here and reach the market before evening fell over the forest? Holding Truc Lam close, Trieu Duong lifted his eyes once more toward the road ahead. The answer would have to come before the day was over. The afternoon light stretched longer across the forest floor, turning everything a softer shade of gold. The air was no longer as cool as the morning, but there was a quiet calm settling over the land. Trieu Duong stood still for a moment, holding Truc Lam gently against his chest. He could feel her small breaths, slow and steady, and that alone gave him a sense of peace. But time was moving, and there was still more to do. He looked once more at the small fenced patch of land. It was only the beginning, but it was enough to take the next step. If he wanted the garden to grow, he needed seeds, and that meant going to the market. Carefully, he wrapped Truc Lam back against his body, this time in front so he could keep a closer eye on her during the walk. He adjusted the cloth firmly but gently, making sure her head was supported and her body was comfortable. Before leaving, he stepped inside the stone house for a moment, checking that everything was in place. The small space felt quiet and safe, like it was holding their life together in a simple, steady way. Then without hesitation, he stepped onto the narrow path leading out of the forest. The journey was not short. The path twisted through trees, across uneven ground, and over small patches of loose soil. Each step required care, especially with Truc Lam resting against him. Trieu Duong walked slowly but steadily, one hand always ready to support her if needed. From time to time, he looked down at her, adjusting the cloth, making sure she was not disturbed by the movement. As he walked, he spoke softly again, his voice calm and reassuring. "We're going to get something important," he murmured. "This is for your future." The forest around them seemed alive with quiet sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, the soft crack of twigs underfoot. But none of it distracted him. His focus remained forward. Every step was part of something larger than the journey itself. After some time, the trees began to thin, and the path opened up. The distant signs of the market slowly came into view. Faint sounds, movement, and the presence of other people. It was a different world compared to the quiet forest. There was more noise, more activity, but also more opportunity. Trieu Duong moved carefully through the small market, his eyes scanning for what he needed. He did not rush. He chose with intention. Seeds were not something he could take lightly. He needed vegetables that were simple, to grow, strong enough to survive, and soft enough for future meals when Truc Lam began eating. He stopped at a small stall and looked over the selection. Leafy greens, simple herbs, plants that could grow well in limited space. He asked a few quiet questions, listening carefully to the answers. Then he made his choice. He picked seeds that would grow quickly but steadily. Seeds that could become something gentle, something clean, something he could trust. After securing what he needed, he didn't linger. The sky had already begun to shift. The light was softer now, and he knew the return journey would take time. Holding Truc Lam a little closer, he began walking back. The path felt longer on the return, but his steps remained steady. The small bundle of seeds he carried now felt heavier than its size, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. It was not just the beginning of a garden. It was the beginning of something more stable, more reliable. By the time the stone house came back into view, the light of the day was fading. The forest was quieter again, returning to its evening rhythm. Trieu Duong stepped inside and gently laid Truc Lam down to rest. She stirred slightly but did not cry. He adjusted the cloth beneath her and made sure she was warm. Only after she was settled did he step back outside. The fenced patch of land waited in the dimming light. Trieu Duong knelt down and opened the small bundle of seeds. He held them in his hand for a moment, looking at them carefully. They were small, simple, but full of potential. He began preparing the soil once more, loosening it gently, breaking apart the harder clumps. Then with slow and careful movements, he started planting. Each seed was placed with intention. Each small hole in the soil was covered with quiet care. He did not rush. Even though the light was fading, he worked steadily, making sure everything was done properly. This was not something to be hurried. This was the start of something that needed patience. As he worked, he spoke again, softly, almost like a promise carried by the evening air. "These will grow for you." The last of the light slipped behind the trees as he finished. The small garden was still bare, but now it held something unseen beneath the soil: hope, effort, and a father's quiet determination. Trieu Duong stood up slowly, his body tired, but his expression calm. He looked over the fenced space one last time before turning back toward the house. Inside, Truc Lam slept peacefully, unaware of everything that had been done for her that day. He sat beside her, watching her for a moment in the dim light. Then he reached out and gently placed his hand near hers. Tomorrow the work would continue. But for now, this was enough. He had taken the first step. Trieu Duong spends a full day preparing a safer future for his daughter, Truc Lam. After feeding her in their small stone house, he realizes she will soon need clean, nutritious food beyond milk. Carrying her gently on his back, he first cuts and chops banana trunks to feed the chickens he already raises. Then he clears a patch of land near their home, carefully removing weeds and preparing the soil. Understanding the danger of wild animals, he builds a simple fence to protect the future garden. Despite the long and tiring work, he continues with quiet determination. As the day goes on, he wonders if he can finish everything in time to go to the market and buy seeds before night falls, taking one more step towards securing healthy meals for Truc Lam.